All right, everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Barbara Oakley. She is a professor of engineering at Oakland University. Her work focuses on the complex relationship between neuroscience and social behavior. She has published in outlets as varied as the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. Her research has been described as revolutionary in the Wall Street Journal. She's also the author of Evil Genes, Why Rome Fell, Hitler Rose, Enron Failed, and My Sister Stole My Mother's Boyfriend, and also the editor of Pathological Altruism. So, Dr. Oakley, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Ricardo. It's really nice to be here.
Oh, thank you a lot for that. Okay, so let me ask you first. So I guess it's also very interesting that you studied engineering and now you're dedicated to the behavioral sciences, let's say, particularly neuroscience, but also other things. But okay, there's this interesting thing, and I've also already talked a little bit about it with other people, and particularly behavioral geneticists and other people like that. That is how our genes influence our behavior. And in your books, you focus a lot on some very particular kinds of behaviors that we would consider dysfunctional, I think, like, for example, psychopathy, borderline personality disorder, and also pathological altruism. So, I would like to ask you, why do you call the genes that are associated with these behaviors evil genes? And perhaps there are two sides to this question. The first side is the fact that there are innate aspects to these behaviors, and that's why we talk about the genes associated with them. And the other aspect, perhaps the more moralistic side, that is the using of the term evil in this case.
I think it's because, well, I use that term evil in a little bit of a sense of, well, I think sometimes people today are shying away from any sort of judgment. And what that can do is that can allow evil to take place. And however you might define it, for me, I believe genocide is something that's evil. I think that enjoying torturing people to death is really kind of an evil act. And I mean, I think there are some things that just shouldn't be happening in a modern society. And I think that if you're afraid to put a label, an appropriate label on behavior that is really malign, that sometimes that can help encourage that kind of behavior. So when I say evil genes, of course, genes aren't evil. They're just genes. They allow for behavior, and they allow for hair color, and they allow for what the shape of your teeth are. I mean, any number of things. But when I first wrote that book, it was not long after Steven Pinker came out with his book on the blank slate. And what his book was trying to grapple with was the fact that many psychologists refused to accept that genes had anything to do with personality. And of course, there's overwhelming evidence that they have a great deal to do with our personality. They're certainly not everything. And environment also plays a very important role. But so what I was trying to explore a little bit in that book, with the tongue-in-cheek title, Evil Genes, ending up in And My Sister Stole My Mother's Boyfriend, which was an indication of the sort of the tongue-in-cheek nature of that. But what I was trying to grapple with was what is that sort of intermixture of environment and genetics in how our personalities unfold? And what I found was something very interesting. At that time, at least, there was almost a refusal on the part of many psychologists to accept that genes had anything to do with how our personalities unfold. And nowadays, you'll speak with psychologists and they'll say, well, we never were like that. But actually, if you go back at that time, they were very clearly like that. And part of what kind of prompted me to begin working on that book, Evil Genes, was I wanted to explore what science had to say about why people do very nasty things. And I'm not talking about the clearly psychopathic behavior of some individuals with antisocial personality disorder. I'm talking about the kind of behavior when, for example, a manager of your acquaintance who's up the chain a little bit from you might be super nice. They're just so friendly, and when you meet them, they're just as great. And then when you turn around, they will lie. They will stab you in the back. They will really do very hurtful things, even though they can obviously function as normal. In fact, they can appear as really helpful and friendly people, especially to the ones that are their supervisors. So I wanted to try and explore that kind of sort of malign behavior. And the problem for me was you can't find any research on mean people. I mean, how do you Google that up, or how do you use PubMed to explore mean people? You can't use those as search terms. So I finally found this one term, malignant narcissism, that seemed to encompass that kind of nasty behavior that I was trying to research, and I was thrilled. I finally found this psychological term with hundreds and hundreds of papers that were published on this. And then I went to see what the science behind it was. What did they do as far as functional magnetic resonance imaging and genetic studies and so forth? There was not a single published paper that available on PubMed that talked about what was actually going on physically. So here was this term that psychologists bandied about, and they used it all the time, and they published thousands of research papers on it, and it had no scientific foundation whatsoever. And so that's what really got me interested in looking at this whole area of what does science really have to say about human behavior.
Okay, very well. So I guess that most of the conditions, at least that we're going to talk about today, like psychopathy, Machiavellianism, borderline personality disorder, and other things like that, of course, they have always negative consequences, both to the individual, to his or her immediate community, and perhaps even to society more generally. But I mean, do you agree with us labeling them as disorders, pathologies, or diseases? And I'm asking you this because nowadays we have this discipline called evolutionary psychiatry, in which researchers more and more say that perhaps many of these conditions might have played some positive role during our evolutionary history, and perhaps we should deal with them in a different, or we should view them in a different light. So what would you have to say about that?
I think that I would very much welcome the evolutionary psychologists who are working in this realm um, to just hang out with psychopaths and start working with them in a functional way. And I'd love to see what their conclusions were after about 6 months or so, if they were still around.
Okay. That was a very interesting answer. Okay, let's get more specific then, because you dedicated, or at least you were one of the editors of a book called Pathological Altruism. So, what is this condition specifically?
Well, before I go back, before I answer this, I'd just like to revisit just for a moment. If you So there were some studies done on chickens to see what they could do to help find chickens that really, and to breed chickens that had big eggs and that were super, super beneficial, for breeders, in that they were great egg layers and so forth. So they got a bunch of chickens, and they put them in cages, and then within each cage, and I can't remember, but exactly the number within each cage, but let's pause at 20 chickens per cage. And so within each cage, they bred only for chickens that laid the best eggs, that they were biggest and so forth. And so what they found, that after they always picked the best laying chicken and bred that generation after generation, and then they found in the end that the chickens that they produced through this method were psychopathic chickens, because the chickens that were successful and had large eggs and so forth were the ones who were best at stealing the food of the other chickens, hurting the other chickens and gathering their resources and so forth. So you could say, in some sense, that what was being done was a sort of an evolutionary experiment. We were propelling evolution in a certain direction that we had selected, but what that ended up with is that we had chickens that could only function for themselves. And what we were really selecting for was chickens that couldn't work very well with others. They could just take their stuff, which actually, sure, that can be evolutionarily positive for those chickens. But then, I mean, it doesn't actually produce groups of chickens that can function very well together, or actually, work well as groups. And so they had chickens they laid eggs okay, but they were so dysfunctional that you couldn't actually do anything with them, as far as you wouldn't want to breed for those chickens. But I think it's a little like that with psychopaths. Sure, there is something from an evolutionary perspective to say, me first, only my feelings. If you bother me, I will kill you or do something really hurtful, so I can gain from it. And it is a positive thing from an evolutionary perspective, but it sure isn't that good for society. And do you really want to be breeding for that or encouraging that? So anyway, to go on to pathological altruism, that is, it's a term that's been used before, and it simply means that you're doing something that, at least to you, seems like it's helpful to other people. But the reality is, and there's always all sorts of caveats, because there's no such true thing as objectivity, unless you're looking at something very simplistic and very mathematical. But from the perspective of us as objective an observer as possible, when they look at what's unfolding, did you really help the individual that you had meant to help, or did you either A, simply make yourself feel better, or B, actually maybe even harm the individual that you ostensibly had set out to help.
Yes, and I guess it must be very difficult for most people to consider the possibility that many times perhaps some well-meaning tendencies that some people have might in fact lead to bad outcomes, right?
That's exactly right. For example, I'm going to give one that many people that you can pretty much see that it is a negative outcome. But let's say that you have a brother who's a drug addict, and the brother comes to you and says, "My God, please just give me what I need for my next hit because I'm trying to get my life in order. I just really, all I need is for you to give me this money for my next hit." Or maybe he doesn't even say that. Maybe he says, "I am trying to get my life together. I need $2,000 to get a place to stay where I'm actually off the streets and so forth." And if you give him that $2,000, is he really going to use it for that? Or are you simply encouraging him? You feel better. Oh, I've really helped him, and yet you may have ample evidence that he's not really going to use it for what he's saying he's going to use it for. So, in fact, that $2,000 could have perhaps been used in a much better way to help your own children or others who might actually be able to do something much more beneficial for that $2,000.
Okay, so I guess that pathological altruism, we could say that works both ways. That is, that the person that is pathological altruist might be exposed to exploitation by other people, but also that that person, even if she doesn't mean to do so, might damage the recipients of her altruism by indulging in some of their bad habits, correct?
That's true. So I'll give another example that sort of fleshes this out. In the 1930s, a study was done with 500 Boston schoolboys, and they took these boys and divided them into two groups, and they carefully matched one for the other. So one turned into the control, so it was 250 boys roughly in the control group and 250 boys in the intervention group. And some of these boys were from good families, some from problematic families. All of this was matched. So they took these boys, and the control group they did nothing to. And the intervention group, they gave them every conceivable bit of advantage and help that they could imagine. So they enrolled the kids in great summer camps. They allowed them to have tutors and so forth. They helped the family. They even helped with babysitting, and they had medical care, just everything that you could imagine that was a great advantage for these kids. Then some 30 years later, they followed up on all of these individuals, as many as they could find, which actually was the vast majority. And when they asked the people themselves who had been involved in the program whether they thought it helped, they said yes, it was really helpful. But when they went and looked at the actual statistics of the control group versus the intervention group, they found that one group had far higher rates of being incarcerated in jail, drug addiction, alcohol abuse, suicide, just all sorts of behavior we deem very problematic. They even ended up in lower sort of, they didn't go as high in their careers. They were much lower caliber, career outcomes. And so you might ask which group was which. And of course, it was the intervention group that had all of these negative outcomes, Why? We're still wondering why. But did it harm their ability to develop their own sense of grit when you just gave them things? So there's a lot of things we just think are obviously going to be useful for groups of people, and in some sense we may be actually harming their ability to develop the kinds of skills that will really help them be successful in life.
Mhm. Okay, very well. So, and as does psychological altruism have some sort of correlation with some psychological traits, like, for example, the Big Five? Because when we talk about heritable psychological traits, some of the first that come to mind are related to the Big Five. So, I would imagine that, for example, pathological altruism might have a high correlation with the trait of I'm forgetting right now, but it's not with agreeableness.
It really, because pathological altruism is not a sort of a diagnostic term, it's an observation of what people do. So people can be motivated to indulge in pathologically altruistic behavior from a variety of different sources. For example, I mean, there's no real psychological, diagnosis of being overly certain of oneself, but certainly sort of an overabundance of self-confidence has actually led to far more damage through history than not being quite as confident in oneself. But I think sometimes pathological altruism can be committed by those who are they are certain. They know inside, they feel it's right to help somebody in some manner, and damn the torpedoes, it doesn't matter if you can show them all the evidence in the world, and they know inside that they are right. And so that can be a great source of pathological altruism. Certainly agreeableness, sort of less on a societal level, but more on a personal level. If you're a really agreeable person who just wants people to like you, then it can be a lot easier to kind of fall into this, because people know that you can be manipulated because you want to be liked. And so again, that brother can say, oh, really, all I need is this 2,000. You've always been the one to come through for me, and I really need your help this time. So what he's really doing is he's punching those buttons. He knows that he can manipulate you because you want to feel good about you're the one who's always the helper, and he's manipulating you basically because of your own agreeableness, which he knows very well. So certainly agreeableness can be, but pathologies of altruism can arise from all sorts of different things. They can arise simply, you can be a very smart person who maybe isn't even very agreeable about things, and you can question. But if you haven't had real experience with individuals who, with some of the ways that you can be manipulated, you can be fooled. I mean, you can trust a politician, and you may even say, well, I don't trust politicians, but you can still be manipulated by a politician who is saying, oh, they're doing X, whatever X is, and it's a really good thing. And on the surface, it may sound super good, but you may not be thinking of the fact that, wait a minute, has science really checked this program out? Is the money that you would put into this program really worth, Could it have been put into some other program that actually had been checked out scientifically? I was just at the National Institutes of Health, and it's really shocking. The National Institutes of Health in the United States is extremely concerned at the shoddy science that is being put out through sources that are funded by the U.S. government, and there's poor, small sample sizes, bias on the part of the researchers, non-blinded studies when you could do blinded. In fact, something like perhaps 10 to 20% of scientific studies, and it depends on the discipline and so forth, are actually can be replicated by others and actually are done in accordance with the scientific method. A lot of times researchers won't even share the data source that they've used. So they may develop something and they'll do all their experiments based on this set of data, but they're not going to show you that data. They collected that data. But unless you can do the same thing with that same data, you have no idea what kind of bias might have slipped in there. And of course, there's many, many other problems in science. And to the credit of National Institutes of Health, they are attempting to begin to get a good handle on it. But a lot of these problems can arise because of researchers' own good intentions.
Mm-hmm. Yes, very interesting. And what is the relationship between altruism and empathy? And I'm asking you this because, over many years, people have been putting empathy on a pedestal when they're saying that, for example, we need more empathy and that empathy leads unequivocally to good results and helps moving humanity forward in terms of moral development and moral progress. But recently there have been some people, like for example Paul Bloom, questioning that position.
So I'm just going to give a rough rule of thumb, a heuristic, but empathy can often, how we define words can often change no matter, depending on where you go and look at the definition of that word. And so there is no underlying truth digest that we can go and look at what's the real meaning of empathy and what's the real meaning of altruism, because it'll vary depending on what source you go and look at. But in some sense, empathy often relates to your emotions, and altruism is not necessarily related to your emotions. It's often thought of as doing good for someone else that may come at a cost to yourself. So emotions are not necessarily in that picture. So empathy, I think there's empathy can be a good thing. It's certainly what helps us sometimes to help someone who is lying on the street and they've fallen down, and we're trying to help them because we feel a little of what they feel or what they could be feeling. But empathy can also be a double-edged sword, because it can pull us in a direction where we can be manipulated. So again, going back to that, your drug addict brother who uses his empathy to get you to do things that you don't, that maybe will actually even harm him, but you just want to kind of in the moment make him feel happier. We can have empathy for those who really just want to manipulate us. And so, empathy is a handy-dandy tool to get someone to do something that's pretty bad. Hitler used to say something along the lines of, once I appeal to their sense of caring, of wanting to do good for others, that's when I've really got them. Because, of course, people can often think of their own group as being the group that should be helped, and whether that group shares your own background, your culture, your politics, your whatever, suddenly that group can become the one you're really empathetic towards, and then that means you can treat other groups more unfairly, more easily.
Yes, exactly. Okay, and isn't it also the case that when pathological altruism has a moral flavor to it, then it might further complicate things? Because, I mean, if someone is convinced that whatever they're doing is for the greater good, and, for example, they get completely consumed by the rightness of their actions, I mean, from that point on, it must be very difficult for them to break out of those patterns of behavior, right?
It can be, you are exactly right. It can be very, very difficult. And the only thing I can think to sort of discriminate is which one do you rate higher, more highly? Do you rate it better to be truthful or to help others? Because if you rate helping others more highly, it is much easier to slip right into pathological altruism. You're able to justify almost anything you do because, hey, it's for the greater good. And I think that way lies that's I think an increasing problem in our society today, that people are slipping away from that enlightenment idea that there is some sort of truth. Everything isn't relative. I mean, if you lie about something, if you flat out lie about it, that's not just a relative thing. That's something that contributes to lack of trust that ultimately can harm society and harm everyone.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so now let's go a bit back and talk about some conditions that you refer to in evil genes, like psychopathy, Machiavellianism, and borderline personality disorder, as I already said. So, on the one hand, I guess that it is much easier for people who are exposed to other people with these conditions for them to treat the behaviors that result from them as being negative. But on the other hand, it is also the case that it is very easy for people to be manipulated by people who suffer from these psychological conditions, right?
Yes, yes. So the question then is, so what exactly is the question then?
Well, perhaps the question is that at the same time, people more easily treat these behaviors as negative. They are also perhaps more easily manipulated by people who suffer from them, I guess.
I think so. I think it's just easy. The younger you are, the less experience you've had in meeting people like this, and so the easier it can be to be manipulated. And as you grow older, you just inevitably begin to encounter more and more individuals like this. And if you have, a normal individual's intelligence, you begin to gradually become a little bit more wary of people, and also there is a cultural aspect, a societal aspect. Interestingly, those societies that have been under communism for a longer period of time, this was a paper by Dan Ariely and his group, has shown that the longer that society was a communist society, the less trust there is in that society. And I'm not sure how that arises, but I do think that under some societal and governmental constructs, it's easier for certain malign individuals to rise higher, and that when you have more malign individuals who are in governing positions where they really have a lot of impact on people, it can be a very harmful thing as far as societal trust and sort of that feeling that who you're dealing with is a person of integrity. You have to just be much more wary in certain circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so in your work and in your research, when you're dealing with these psychological issues, what are you most interested in understanding about them? Their innate aspects, or perhaps some of the more developmental aspects? What are the things that you focus the most on?
Well, to me, the whole issue has just been a fascinating one. I'm not so interested in, what are individuals like this like as toddlers or even as teenagers. I am more interested in how does it manifest in society in adults. And there's pretty good evidence that the great bulk of the time you have a sort of an admixture of environmental influences with genetic influences. But in some individuals, for example, if you are from a very, very well-to-do family and you manifest psychopathic sorts of traits, you in all probability have a much greater biological load, a sort of a genetic tendency towards these kinds of issues. Whereas if you are not from such a well-to-do family, it's much more likely that environment has played a role in how you have, how you've matured. And I think that's understandable too, because if you have parents who beat you, or you had a horrible school system that made you hate school, and maybe you had really good parents, but you were around gangs, and really the only way you could grow up was to be very, very violent and not very trusting towards others and so forth. Well, you can see the environment would play an enormously important role in perhaps you turning out to be a bit antisocial in how you interact with others.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. I think that you just perhaps summarized one of the rules of behavior genetics, and I'm talking about this because I've already had behavior geneticists on the show, like Dr. Eric Turkheimer and Dr. Matt McHugh and others, and we talked exactly about that, about the fact that if people develop in an environment that really has bad conditions, then the effects of the environment over their psychology, let's say, are bigger than someone who lives in better conditions.
Absolutely. I think that's where I've ultimately gone in my work, is I'm working to help provide better educational materials, or materials that kids who are even from attending perhaps a school system that is pretty disadvantaged. So what I've been working on is to develop a lot of great videos, as well as, books aren't going to be very appealing for someone who's grown up in a really, really tough environment necessarily. But well-made videos, pretty much everybody can enjoy those and get something out of it. So I have a new set of videos coming out with Arizona State that will soon be on Coursera, that are directly for kids to help provide at least a little bit of a ladder that even if they don't have perhaps the best educational resources available to them through their school system, they can still learn a little bit about learning, and that might be beneficial for them in the long run.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very well. And apart from those videos, Dr. Oakley, where can people find your work on the internet?
Oh, just go to barbaraoakley.com, and there's all sorts of information about my books, and with Terence Sanowski, the Francis Crick professor at the Salk Institute, I teach the world's largest course on learning. It's about 2.5 million students so far, called Learning How to Learn, so you can find a link to that. And thank you so much for having me on your show, Ricardo. It's been fantastic.
Oh, it's been a very big pleasure of mine. So I will be leaving all of the links to that in the description box of this video for viewers to go check those resources out. And Dr. Oakley, again, thank you a lot for taking the time.
It is my pleasure.
Hi guys, thank you so much for watching this video until the end. I would also like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and see if you can make a pledge there. I would really be thankful for that. And finally, I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons Karen Litzke, Anne Blanche, Per Helga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelinas and Jim Frank. Thank you a lot for all.